recording now.
Okay.
Did you guys get a notification or anything when I started it? Okay.
In the corner.
Oh, it does now.
Oh, okay. I feel like do I have to ask her if it's okay first?
You could just let her know at the beginning that you're recording it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh gosh, it's almost 4.
I don't think she's gonna show up. You think?
What are we supposed to do if she doesn't?
I
You
don't
should wait
know.
till like 4:05, 4:10, and if she doesn't, I don't know, email about a different time, maybe.
Yeah, I guess just email her.
Well, she said she could Friday at 2 also. So I guess if she doesn't show up by like 4:10, 4:15, then I'll just shoot her an email.
Did she
Like,
respond
hey.
to the email that you said about?
No, which I thought was weird because she emailed me back so quickly on all of the other ones.
I feel like she's a busy lady, maybe. I don't know.
I know it's tax season. Is it audit season?
Apparently, they don't really have like a designated busy season. What I heard.
Well,
Oh.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are all of you today?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, good.
You getting the online learning thing figured out?
I think so. I guess we'll find out on our final grades.
Yeah, that's a good time to find out.
Heidi, is it okay if we record this session in case we missed anything in our notes?
Yeah, that's
That way
fine.
we can go back. Okay, just thought
Yeah.
I'd swing that by you. And then I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Courtney. I'm the one who's been emailing you.
Yes.
I'm Carly.
Hi, Carly. It's nice to have another Zimmerman.
Yeah.
And I'm Connor.
Hi, Connor.
I'm Marie.
Hi, Marie.
Okay, do we want to just start, guys?
Sure.
Fire away.
So I have a few warm-up questions before we dive into like our general audit questions.
Okay.
The first one is, what made you choose auditing as your career path?
Say I chose it would probably be a little bit of an overstatement. It probably more like fell into it. My master's degree is actually in history. While I was working on my master's degree, I worked for a public policy institute on the campus of Fort Hays and realized that I liked public policy analysis, at least as much, if not more, than I liked historical research. And so I spent a year with the Sentencing Commission doing research for them. And then a friend of mine, her dad actually was a legislator and mentioned that post audit had some job openings and thought my skill set might match. I didn't actually think of myself as someone who would enjoy auditing really, but once I started to understand what they did, I realized policy analysis. And so I went ahead and thought maybe that would be a good match and applied for a job, obviously got it. But I really fell into auditing. It was never something that I thought I would do.
Cool. So what made you choose this company as the best fit for you? I guess you kind of already touched on that, how your skill set matched a lot.
Yeah, they at the time that I kind of applied, they post audit had gotten some additional positions to do more auditing of schools, and so there were some extra positions available. And like I said, I thought my experience and just kind of my interest kind of overlapped, and so they were the one who had the job. So here I am.
So what is your favorite thing about working for this company?
When I saw that question, I had to really, there's quite a few things that I like. First of all, just kind of generally in terms of talking about the work, I like the work. Doing something a little different every day, It's a lot of analysis. We're a nonpartisan office, which means that even though we kind of work in the political environment, we are not political at all. And so that's kind of a nice thing to work in government, but not have to be political. But the work is always very challenging. We do lots of different things, which I like. And specifically, we are a fairly progressive sort of organization, especially for state government. We have a lot of work from home. So when we went to work from home full time, this was not actually a huge change for a lot of us. Many of us already work from home, at least part time. We are very, we don't worry so much about the number of hours you work. It's more about what you produce. And if you produce good work, and you meet your deadlines, nobody really cares how many hours you're sitting in your chair, which is nice as well. So the environment at Post Audit it's a very professional, very highly professional organization, but you get treated like an adult, and there's lots of nice things that come with that.
So what is the number one characteristic you look for in someone becoming an auditor?
The number one thing we look at is critical thinking skills. We hire on a pretty regular basis, and lately I've been sitting on those selection committees. So we actually talk about this a lot, but the number one thing is just critical thinking and the ability to kind of, to look at information and ask deeper questions about it, to look at data and be able to say, that data doesn't make sense, or this thing that I heard today doesn't match what I heard yesterday, and being able to kind of critically think about everything that you're hearing and everything you're seeing, being skeptical about those things, and then being able to kind of put all the pieces together.
Relating to auditing and accounting, what level of qualifications do you have?
Well, I said my master's degree is actually in history, and so I had no accounting, actually no auditing period. But now I've been an auditor for 15 years, and I carry something called a CGAP, which is a certified government auditing professional, which is basically I passed the test. So that's what that means. So, but it requires a certain level of experience and kind of understanding of general auditing principles as well. So, but no real accounting background. A lot of learning on the job.
Nice. And then what does an average day look like for you?
It's hard to say what an average day, every day is a little bit different. I'd say probably as a supervisor, an average day involves, reviewing a lot of work papers and sitting in on a lot of meetings, talking to auditees, that kind of thing. As a principal auditor in the office, we also carry a lot of other responsibilities, legislative responsibilities. And so some days I might be talking to legislators or presenting an audit to a committee or something like that. So there's quite a bit of variety from day to day.
And now we'll move into some more general auditing questions. How would you describe the process of going through an audit?
In terms of basically the process we use to conduct an audit?
Yeah.
Okay. So audits have a few different phases. We start with planning. When we plan an audit, we do a few things. We look for background information. Sometimes we go talk to the agency to kind of get some basic information about the program or whatever it is we're auditing. We do what's called a risk management assessment. So we try to assess kind of how risky the audit is. And out of the planning stage comes something called a task list, which is a list of everything we're going to do through the entire course of the audit. So every work paper we're going to write, everything we're going to do gets written down into that task list. And so that's kind of the end result of planning. Then we move into field work, and we go and do all those things that we said we were going to do on the task list. And that can be just talking to people, that can be running surveys, that can be looking at data, that can be doing file reviews. So fieldwork can take a lot of different forms. Once we're done with fieldwork, then we start writing, and we have to write a report. We're, I think, required by our standards to produce some sort of written document. So we write a report, and we take kind of all of those work papers and all of those findings and try to translate it into something, you know, people can read and understand what we found. And then after we write that report, we present that report to our committee. And once that is done, then we just move into an administrative phase called wrap up. And that's just, we have paperwork that has to be completed and make sure work papers got signed off on and all the right signatures are in the right place. And so that's just really an administrative phase, but that's kind of the general process for an audit.
Okay, perfect. So are certain documents required, or do you have to fill certain data whenever you're doing the audit, or specifically for the K-12 at-risk funding audit?
So during the planning phase of an audit, we do have very specific kind of paperwork that we do fill out for every audit. We did that, of course, for the at-risk audit, but it's things called planning assessments, making sure we've planned the audit appropriately, making sure we've looked at the risks of the audit as well. So there is some paperwork we do in the planning stage always. In terms of other things, we always do work papers, and work papers are basically just a written just kind of a written documentation of what we found. We usually have a short audit might only have a dozen or so work papers. A big audit like at risk, I think, had probably close to 100 work papers. And so those work papers, each one is a little different. So each work paper will have a purpose. And so the thing that you'll have to do is make sure that your whatever work you did kind of answers that purpose statement. And so, but that work can be really different. Sometimes that's reading just reading statutes and summarizing statutes. Sometimes it's doing a literature review. Sometimes it might be looking at a data set and analyzing data. Other times it might be just conducting an interview and going to talk to people to just try to understand things. So that happens in every audit as well. Just how much of it happens depends on how big the audit is.
Okay. I did send you our rough draft flow chart. I'm not sure if you got a chance to look at it. I know you you actually described really well the process of auditing. Would you say that ours was somewhat close to what your flow chart looks like?
I'd say you actually were pretty close. There's probably a few tweaks to it, but it wasn't too far off.
Okay, that makes me feel good because I did that. Let's see here. So do you have like partner auditors during the audit? Do certain people go do the interviews and then report back to you, or do you report to someone? Just kind of like the flow of information.
So an audit team is composed usually of a handful of people. And so at the top is the audit manager. And the audit manager is usually managing a couple audits at a time. But the manager sits kind of way up here and kind of watches the audit from, call it the kind of the 20,000 foot view. They're just making sure it's kind of stays on track and that we don't get lost in the nuance, so that we just have the bigger view. And then there is an audit supervisor, which is usually what I am, and it's what I was for the at-risk audit. The audit supervisor plans the audit, manages it on a day-to-day basis, make sure it's going, make sure the work papers are getting, the supervisor is the one who reviews all the work papers, make sure it stays on time, and does all the day-to-day troubleshooting. We talk about a lot of times in our office, the supervisor is like the quarterback of a football team. They're calling a lot of the shots. And then we have a team, and the team can be anywhere from usually 2 or 3 people. Sometimes they get a little bigger. We try not to let the teams get too big because that creates some other issues. And then the team does the work papers. So they're the ones doing the work papers and then turning those work papers into the supervisor, who is reviewing them, checking them, making sure they're in good shape. And then the supervisor turns them over to the manager for a little different kind of review, but they're still reviewing them as well. So there's kind of a little bit of a hierarchy, I guess.
Okay. Let's see. Have you guys developed any like systems for reducing the number of errors when conducting an audit?
We have many systems for that. That is actually a key piece of being an auditor, is finding ways to reduce those errors because they can creep in unlikely places. Because we're a legislative audit office, so the legislature reads our reports and they base policy and law and take measures that are very much in response to our audits. And so it is critical that the audits are right every single time. So we have a very low threshold for errors. So what we call it's called a risk appetite. So how much risk are you willing to assume? We are willing to assume a very, very low amount of risk. Part of the way we do that is we've set a goal that we will set our processes in such a way that will lead us to not have to recall an audit more than once every 5 years. And in fact, I think we have not recalled an audit in at least 5 years. In fact, I think the last one we recalled was about 5 years ago. So that process works, but we take a lot of steps to reduce those errors, starting with, usually starts with the supervisor. So the supervisor is reviewing work papers, and then the manager reviews them too. Like, so the manager reviews them at a higher level, but pretty much every work paper gets reviewed twice. When we plan the audit, we do a risk management, which when we brainstorm what could happen during this audit that could lead us to be wrong, and what is the likelihood of those things occurring. And so we brainstorm those things and then take measures to control for those things when we come up with them to make sure that we are not wrong. Then I think during the writing process, so when we write a report, that is also a place where things can go off the rails pretty easy, because you're taking work from work papers and trying to write a report. And it's very easy to misstate or overstate or transpose numbers or do those kinds of things that would lead to a report having an error in it. And so before the report is released, every number and every fact in a report gets checked between 2 and 4 times. So that means at least twice, and sometimes as many as 4 times, someone is looking at that number in the report and tracing it back to the work paper and making sure it is accurate. So that's kind of our last way of making sure there aren't any errors in the report. We also give the report to the auditee before it's released publicly, and give them a chance to provide feedback as well. And sometimes they will point out, hey, you didn't describe that quite right, or I'm not sure that number is accurate. Can you go look and double check your numbers again? And so we try to listen to those auditees and their concerns and make changes if we feel that we truly were in error. We'll make those changes before the draft is released. So there are multiple levels of review and things we do throughout the whole process to make sure there is not an error in that final report.
How do you handle giving feedback? I know that on this audit, there was some pushback. Who was it? The Kansas Department of Education, or what? There was like a few of them that had pushback from the audit saying it was not right.
Yes. We try to listen to the auditee when they tell us something is not right, and to first of all listen to them and have an open mind about things. We can be wrong, so we want to listen to them. I think that's kind of what we emphasize, is just not digging our heels in so much that we refuse to hear their arguments. So we listen. In this particular case, you're right, there was a tremendous amount of pushback, not only from the department and the state board, but also from other organizations as well. And we had a couple of very long, very involved conversations with the department while they were reviewing the report. And we simply, we simply disagreed. They had their own interpretation of state law. We felt that interpretation was incorrect and did not align with state law, and we didn't make changes. They had their own view. It turns out that actually their view was probably not what legislators intended. In fact, legislators are trying to change the law right now to reflect exactly what we thought it was saying in the first place. But we try to listen and be open-minded, and there are times where we do go back and say, no, they're probably right. We need to change that a little bit. In this particular one, some of what they told us just didn't make sense. Some of it was not supported by the evidence, and some of it was just an interpretation we felt was faulty, and we didn't make changes.
As an auditor, what different types of software have you worked with, and what computer-assisted audit technique tools have you heard or learned about?
We still, for all the office-wide, we use a number of things, but the things we still use most are probably Excel spreadsheets. Excel has improved their capabilities for statistics and databases and analytics substantially over the last 10 years or so, and so we use Excel a lot. We use a lot of the different capabilities that Excel has. We also use Access some, not quite as often as we used to, but it's a good database tool, so we do still use it. We're moving, trying to think. When I first started, we used SPSS a lot, but we don't do that hardly at all anymore. We have people who use R now. We use ArcGIS. Sometimes we get audit questions that have kind of where ArcGIS is actually very helpful in terms of visualizing data. And so we use that really as often as we can. It's actually kind of a cool tool, and we actually like using it. We just don't always get the opportunity to do it. Trying to think if there's anything. We've been using NVivo, which is a tool that analyzes, I guess I'm not sure what its purpose is. I know how we use it. We use it to analyze survey results. So you get survey results for like open-ended questions, which is very time consuming to read through all of those open-ended questions and code them. And so we've used NVivo to kind of assist us with that as well. But we're pretty open. Pretty much if someone on the team says, hey, I have this idea, or I have this tool that I think would work for, to answer this question or to problem solve this issue, we're pretty open. We let people be a little bit experimental with things and give things a go. So
nice. Has there ever been a situation where you needed to use hard data to prove something in an audit?
Hard data as in like numbers rather than qualitative?
Yes.
Yeah, we use data a fair amount. There are audits sometimes that are very qualitative in nature. We call them very squishy audits. As auditors, they are not usually our favorite audits. We prefer numbers and dealing with things that are harder. Pretty often, yeah, we pretty regularly have to use data to get to the answer. So for example, the at-risk audit, one of the questions was regarding how much money do people, how much money do school districts spend on at risk? And so that involved us getting accounting records and looking at how much money they spent. I know there was an audit here, I think a year ago, 2 years ago, where it wasn't an audit I worked on, but the team was supposed to be evaluating the impact of a program called CanCare, which is how Kansas delivers Medicaid services. And they used some really sophisticated regression models to kind of predict the effect, or to show the effect that CanCare has had and might have in the future on costs and health outcomes as well. And so that was a very kind of hard data sort of audit as well.
What would you say was the biggest challenge of the at-risk audit?
The biggest challenge probably happened at the end with dealing with the department, and they, like I said, they pushed back a lot. We had some concerns about whether we were getting the straight answers sometimes. Just coping, I think probably just managing their feedback, and making sure that we were listening and that we were giving them a fair shot, and also being sure that we weren't being persuaded at the last minute by something that sounded good but didn't actually have any evidence. We did a lot of that at the very end of the audit. We were right up to the deadline on that audit, trying to work with the department to get things figured out. And so I would say that was pretty challenging. Also, when we released the report, there were legislators who were not pleased with the results, and I think kind of took that out on us. It was kind of kill the messenger. And I stood in some committees and had to answer questions that were, in some cases, very personal questions that were, essentially trying to smear our qualifications, and in some cases my credentials specifically. And that was not a lot of fun, and it was a challenge to stay cool in those situations and answer questions respectfully, even when they were very highly charged and oftentimes not fair, and sometimes just not accurate.
Okay, and I have some questions, but first I was curious about where they misinterpret, or where they interpreted the law differently than what you guys did.
So like how the department interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
The department, there were a few places where interpretation kind of came apart. Trying to remember. First of all, one was the state law requires the state board to, and in this case, the state board is the Department of Education. They're not the same entities, but the department was in charge of doing these things. But requires them to go out and approve programs and practices that are effective. So things that work, and then have the school districts only spend their at-risk funding on those things. And we took a lot of issue with the things that they had selected, that A, they weren't for at-risk, and B, they didn't have evidence behind them, or they at least couldn't produce any evidence behind them that indicated that they worked. And the department felt that they had simply done those things, and we disagreed. The other part was just some interpretation of what it meant to approve programs and practices. The department felt that approved practices and programs by letting the districts kind of do whatever they wanted to do and then approving that. And they viewed that as okay. We said, no, we don't think that's what statute says. Statute says you need to approve it essentially first, and then have the districts spend their money on those things, not let the districts do whatever they want and then approve it at the end. So the department really felt that they had fulfilled the requirements of that state law. And of course, we felt that they had not. In the end, legislators, I think, agreed with us and felt that the department had not done what was intended. And they do plan to change state law to make it more clear that they do intend and they do want the department to approve things up front and find things that work and make sure that the school districts are doing those things, and not just approving whatever they do at the end.
Okay. And then, so how did you determine which schools that you were going to audit? Like, I know we kind of went into it in the audit. But.
Yeah, for those 20 districts that we chose, we just tried to choose a cross-section of school districts. So at-risk funding is based on the number of kids in the school district who get a free lunch, so which is kind of a proxy measure of poverty. So we wanted to choose 20 districts that had kind of a wide variety of poverty. So some that were very poor, like Coffeyville and Wichita, and also districts that were reasonably affluent, like Fort Leavenworth. I think Blue Valley might have been in there. And so we wanted to make sure we had a good variation there. We also wanted to make sure that we were kind of geographically balanced so that we had districts on both sides of the state, as well. Sometimes we lean a little heavy on the eastern side of the state and forget about the western side. So we wanted to make sure that we had some good coverage across the state. We didn't really choose anyone I'll take that back. We chose Wichita because they are so big and because they have such a large percentage of the kids. They were chosen because they were so big, but everybody else was just chosen to get a good cross section, and there wasn't really any specific reason for them.
Okay. And then how or why did you narrow down the scope of the audit to these 3 questions? Now, how does the method Kansas uses to count the number of at-risk students in a district compare to other methods? How does the funding school districts receive through at-risk and high-density at-risk weightings compare to what districts spend to provide services to those students? And has at-risk funding been calculated in accordance with state law? And how do districts spend that funding? Like, was that what the legislator gave you, or did you guys narrow that down after?
Every audit that we do has something called a scope statement. Actually, I guess now it's called an audit proposal. For a long time, we called them scope statements, and then we've changed their name. So every audit has an audit proposal. And an audit proposal has a little bit of background information, and then the question or questions that we will answer for that audit. Typically speaking, in April, we take those audit proposals that legislators have contacted us with. And legislators come to us a lot of times, or committees come and say, hey, we have a concern about this thing. Will you write an audit proposal for it? And so we write audit proposals, and they go to the committee, and the committee chooses some number of them every year. And so when we do the audit, we are bound to that. Our audit authority is essentially bound to that audit proposal. That's how it normally works. For the school audits, including the at-risk audit, state statute directs us to conduct school audits, 1 or 2 a year. So last year, state statute said legislative post audit will conduct an audit of at-risk, and provided just a little bit of information about kind of what they wanted included in that audit. So we read that state law and took that law and created a scope statement that matched, for the most part, matched what legislators had put in that state law. So those first couple of questions come almost directly from what legislators had written into law that they said they wanted us to do. The question about calculating whether or not the Department of Education was doing things, calculating funding in compliance with state law, that actually was not part of the request in the statute. We added that question because 2 years ago, during a different audit, we found that the department was violating state law by giving out millions of dollars to school districts every year that was not allowed in state statute. It was a big deal. The person who most masterminded that nearly lost his job. There were calls for him to be fired. He wasn't. But it was a big deal, and it was a lot of money. And so since then, pretty much every audit we do has a component written into it that has us look at what the department is up to.
Okay. And how do the governmental auditing standards differ from the ones you would use out in the field, like not government?
For us, we use the Yellow Book, which is a federal document, so federal auditing standards. They encompass the generally acceptable government auditing standards. I think GAGAS is what it's called. So we audit under the Yellow Book and under GAGAS. That's an agency choice that we have made. In fact, actually, I think it might be in state statute that we're required to use Yellow Book. But each auditing entity can decide what standards it wants to audit under. And so we audit under those, but I've never audited anywhere else, so I'm not sure what other auditing. I know there are other auditing standards out there. Like we use the yellow book. I think there's maybe a red book out there too. So there's a couple of others. We just don't use them at post audit.
Okay. And I guess one that we had about, do you know why the state law does not set a percentage of at-risk funding, but it sets an expectation for special ed funding?
Yeah, those two types of funding are very kind of different beasts, and at-risk does not have, school districts are not required to provide at-risk services, basically. They, of course, all do, but they are not required necessarily in the way that special education is. So in special education, not only are school districts required to do that by state law, they must provide that service by federal law as well. And so there's a lot more federal influence on SPED than there is an at-risk. The state also gets a lot of special education money from the feds as well. And to be eligible for that money, there are lots of things the state has to do. And so I think that the method of funding special education has been somewhat influenced by the federal requirements, and that has shaped a little bit of how they do things. Special education is also much more complicated in determining how much money should you give, how much funding should there be for special education is a much more complicated question than there is for at-risk. And so I think the combination of the federal requirements and the complexity has guided special education to be done the way it is done. And it's just very different from at-risk.
Okay. And then, well, what were some of the main threats, like threats that you experienced during the audit?
You know, we do this risk management document every, except for every audit might come up. And so I dug up that document and kind of looked a little bit at what some of those threats were. And there were a couple of things that occurred to us. One was the data. We got data from 20 different school districts in the state of Kansas. Districts are allowed to use whatever accounting system they want. There is no centralized accounting system. So every district, their internal accounting looks just a little different because everybody's doing their own thing. And that does add a little bit of a complication in terms of getting to the right answer. And so that's a little bit of a threat to us, that we could just misunderstand a particular district, just not be able to figure things out because 20 districts means 20 different systems of doing things. So that was one thing, was just making sure that we could understand the data. Another threat was just kind of managing the Department of Education and just making sure that we stayed real skeptical of what they were telling us. We've had enough interaction with them, and we don't always feel that we're getting the straight answer from them. And so we have to take sometimes some extra steps to make sure that what they're telling us makes sense and is backed up by other things. And so that was also a threat that we identified, that again, if we miss the mark there, that we could end up with the wrong answer. So it was a threat as well.
Okay, and so did that skepticism like all come from when they were giving the schools millions of dollars when they didn't, or has the department done more than that?
Yeah, we have some skepticism because we have seen them in the past kind of do their own thing. With the audit that I mentioned, that 2 years ago, it was a transportation audit, and statute says this is how you're supposed to determine funding, and they mostly followed it, but kind of went out on their own and did their own thing that they really were not allowed to do at all. And so that certainly promoted some skepticism, that this is a department that might do their own thing from time to time and might not, stick to state law as much as we'd like them to. And so we are always skeptical of our auditees. That's part of being an auditor, is not accepting every word they say as being the absolute truth. We're always looking for corroboration. So some skepticism is normal. That's the typical. We probably are a little more skeptical with the department because we've had some audit findings that lead us to make sure that we are careful.
Makes sense. And then you kind of answer this, but how do you decide to do any one audit with the LPA?
Yeah, I said most audits come through our committee. So we have a committee of 10 legislators. There are 5 Senate, 5 representatives, 6 Republicans, 4 Democrats. And most of our audits are chosen by the committee. So we write that audit proposal, we put all those audit proposals in front of them, sometimes 20 or 30 or 40 of them at a time, and they choose 6 or 8 of them. So a lot of the time it comes from that committee, and whatever those legislators are interested in and they want us to do is what we do. Then there is a little piece of them, like the school audits that come through state statute that requires us to do some sort of audit by state law. So we don't get to choose our own audits. We are always either doing audits that are written in state law or that the committee has directed us to do.
Okay. And then how long did this audit take you to complete?
It was a big audit. It's one of our longer audits. We started it, I think, in May, and we're still working on it right up till December. So that's 7 months, I guess. Most of our audits move a lot faster than that. We're one of the faster audit shops in the country. Some states have audits. Audit shops will take a year or 2 to do audits. Our committee likes to see things turned around pretty quickly, and so we try to keep our audits pretty narrowed in scope so that we can turn them around as quickly as possible. So I'd say most of them are like 4 months, 4 or 5 months is more the norm. So 7 months is certainly a longer audit.
All right, so I have a few questions as well. Were there any consistencies in this audit compared to other ones you have performed, or was there anything that was unique or memorable about this audit?
Wow, that's a good question. I would say in terms of the work, it was very consistent. It was kind of a typical audit with the Department of Education and school districts. We kind of have gotten into a rhythm now because we do at least 1, sometimes 2 every year. And so in terms of the work, it was pretty consistent and looked like kind of typical audit work. The result, though, was very atypical. We had there's a tremendous amount of publicity that came with it. It was not well received among a very small group of people. In reality, actually, most legislators actually thought the audit was good and agreed with the audit findings. So it was actually a small group that didn't. They were just very, very loud. So the end result and the publicity and the fact that there were some legislators who were very, very unhappy about it, that part of it was really unique. Quite frankly, most of our audits, we release them. Maybe a committee gets excited about them. Most of the time they don't. Whether the press picks them up or not is hard to, most of the time they don't. So in fact, I think I found this the other day. Here was the Capitol Journal the day after we released the audit. This has never happened before. So this is not the usual response from anybody, is to be on the front page of the Capitol, this CJ. So that was a big thing. Not in any way typical, not necessarily desired either. So it's a lot of stress dealing with an audit that has such high impact findings and that people are not necessarily happy to hear.
All right. Well, given that you report to the Kansas legislator, how long does it take your findings typically for changes to be made?
There's a lot of range there. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes we do things and we make recommendations, sometimes to the agency. Maybe they implement them, and we kind of hope they do, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes it requires legislative action and they just don't do anything. Other times, like the school audits, we get very, very quick action. The at-risk audit, they've already rewritten those laws, and assuming they're allowed to come back in April to finish up their session, they will pass those laws. And so it was a matter of months between the time when we said, hey, there's a problem, and the point where they fixed it. That's pretty unusual, though. Sometimes, actually, I'd say if there's going to be any change made at all, if that's going to even happen at all, it can take years before they make any changes. In fact, someone reminded me the other day that we pointed out a problem with how bilingual education is funded in the state. We pointed out a problem with that back in 2006, and they didn't change the law until 2017. So that one, they did eventually get around to it, but it took a long time.
How do you verify activities that are harder to measure, such as transportation?
I think I lost you there for a minute, Carly. Can you repeat your question?
Yes. How did you verify activities that are harder to measure, such as transportation?
We look for defined data. Sometimes the data set is not available. We have to kind of go make the data set ourselves. So sometimes that can be helpful. A lot of times talking to people, we can sometimes kind of compare and contrast across different people's answers to kind of see what's really out there. At least with the school audits and especially with at-risk, fortunately, they weren't very squishy audits. There's lots of data out there and lots of documentation and lots of documents that help us kind of figure out what the answer is.
Okay, and these are some questions about your information system.
Okay.
So how does your accounting information system help with processing and sorting the collected data?
We don't actually have a real accounting system. For the at-risk audit, we collected accounting data from other people's systems. So 20 different systems. And we actually just had them download things into Excel. And we plopped everything into Excel and analyzed it from there. Sometimes we get accounting records from the state system. And that work usually comes either in Excel or sometimes Access if it's a big enough database. So we just use those tools to analyze whatever records, whether they're accounting records or otherwise. Those are probably our two most common ways of analyzing records.
Okay, so since you have started working there, how has the Excel and Access changed, or has it at all?
Actually, it has. I've been with Post Audit for 15 years in August, so I'm pushing 15 years now. Excel has changed a lot. Their statistical capabilities and their kind of database capabilities have changed substantially, really, in just the last several years. So that's been a big change. Access is still kind of Access. It's not changed that much. How we use it has changed, but the software itself has not changed very much. Probably the biggest change that's happened in the last 15 years has been our work papers. When I first started at Post Audit, work papers were done on paper. They were literally hard copies. We printed them out, put them in big binders, and transferred them back and forth between supervisors and team members. I'm sure we killed half the Amazon or half the rainforest because the amount of paper we went through was ridiculous. And now we have electronic work papers. So we have a system that kind of manages our work papers. It's kind of a homegrown system. So our previous post auditor, actually, when he was still a manager, designed a system for managing our work papers electronically. And so that's probably been the biggest change in the last 15 years, and a great change. Work papers were awful.
I bet. Okay, well, that's all the questions I have. Courtney, did you have any more?
Either of you guys? Connor, Marie? No?
Not right now, but right as we leave the chat, I will.
Well, if you have any more questions, Courtney, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to respond in writing, or if we need to do another Zoom, that's fine too. But you can just let me know. So our office is open. We are on work from home. Other state agencies are still closed and won't be reopening. Actually, they're not reopening really. They're going to work from home policies on Monday. So, but we're still open and we're still up and running and functioning as usual. So if there's something you need, feel free to reach out and I'll do my best to help you out.
Awesome. Thank you for your time, Heidi.
Sure.
Yeah, thank
Good
you.
luck with your project.
Thank you. Bye. Well, that went better than I thought it would.
Yeah.
He's very talkative. That was good. We needed
Really, we
that.
got a lot of stuff, and I wrote down, I think, everything.
And
as she was
I've been
talking, so.
Me
Stop
too.
recording,
I tried to
so we
type
don't-
out everything that she said.
stop.
Yeah.
Is it gonna stop?